Kind of experimental talk, because I feel like sometimes when I go to things like this, I just hear about all this stuff that I don't understand at all, and this is kind of like an intermediate talk rather than, and it's about something that's just in Django. So I'm interested to know what kind of level people are at with Django. I know that there's some amazing experts here, and there's also probably some people that have never even used it. So I'm going to start with a question, which is, which type of view do you prefer? So have a think. It might be function-based, it might be class-based, or it might be what's a view. So does everyone have their answer in their head? Yeah. So could we have a show of hands for A? Okay, cool. And B? And C? Great. Okay, so I'm kind of probably preaching to about, I'm going to be preaching to about a third of the room. So I will try and be fairly quick, particularly in the first sort of 2/3 of this talk, because you're obviously all on the same page as me. I'm going to ask a second question. How's your object-oriented Python? 1, no idea what you're talking about. 2, I'm a bit shaky on how it works. 3, confident with standard stuff such as mixins and method overriding. Or 4, I actually understand what a metaclass is. So who's 1? I should have probably done it in reverse order. How about 2? Yeah, thanks for being honest. 3? Yeah, and 4. Oh, cool, so lots of metaclass people. All right, so good. I'm not going to dwell too much on object-oriented stuff then. I'm going to sort of assume that people understand it. So this is the difference between function-based and class-based. Is this working? It's a bit near my... Yeah, you can hear me? As Anand mentioned earlier, a view is something which receives an HTTP request and returns an HTTP response. So in a function-based view, that's just a function. And in a class-based view, you extend a class and then configure it. Now, you're going to see loads of code in this talk, but I'm actually not going to really dwell on it. You can just look at the slides afterwards if you need to. But that's the main difference to begin with. So in this talk, I'm first of all going to introduce you to 7 views you will come to love. Number 2, I'm going to talk a bit about method overriding. And 3, I'm going to touch on mixins and custom views, which is a little bit more advanced and is more of a matter of opinion about how I use views. So first of all, 7 views you will come to love. So these 7 views are classes that you can extend from when you're using class-based views. And generally, I find I'm usually extending from one of these 7. There are 2 non-model views, and there are 5 model views. So let's have a look. The template view simply renders a template, and you can configure this, and like many other class-based views, you don't actually have to write any code, really. You just configure it in an attribute on the class. A form view. These are great because they prevent you from having to handle the normal form logic that you might do in a function-based view. If you're used to using function-based views, you have to decide whether or not the request is a GET request or a POST request. Then you have to instantiate the form with the data or without, depending on that. Then you need to validate the form. Then you need to do a redirect if it's invalid or valid or whatever. And you've got all this kind of stuff that you're always repeating every time you've got a form. And what form view does is it handles that for you, so you don't need to worry about it anymore. That's why I love it. Then we're going to start looking at some model views. So when you're writing an app, usually you'll have lots of standard patterns. So let's say you've got a website about cats. You will probably have a page with a list of cats on it. And that's what list view is for. It just lists all the models for a particular model. You can customize it, but essentially you may be doing as little code as this, which is that you just specify what the model is, and then that will look for a specific template, in this case cat list, like that, and it will put all the cats into an object list variable, and then you can loop through them. So that's list view. There's lots more you can do with list view, by the way, but that's the idea of it. We've got detail view, which is what you might get when you click through from one of those list views onto a single page about a cat. So that just displays a single object. And then we have create view, which handles the logic around a form that creates a cat in the first place, creates a model. It might be you just write that much code and you get all the processing. We've got update view, which is the editing view for a cat or any other model if you're not writing a website about cats, which is possible. And we've got delete view. You see, in all of them, you've got quite a similar API for doing it. So those are the views. Generally, when you're starting out with class-based views, it's just great to think, well, like, which one of these is it? It's probably one of them whenever you're writing a page. Part 2, method overriding. We're getting a bit more advanced here. So you can override these class-based views a lot. And I've just put up a simple diagram of the class-based views hierarchy. Basically, it's completely impossible to remember or understand the class-based view hierarchy as far as I can work out. So much so that someone's actually written a simpler version called Django Vanilla Views, which if you can't be bothered to work with this, it's a bit simpler. Personally, I prefer the core views. But the point is that you don't have to remember this. You can just like look around and work out what to use because it's all open source after all. So there are 3 particular ways in which you can look in more detail at how these work. There's the Django documentation, which is very good for class-based views. There's also the source code, which is probably what I use most. I just tend to navigate between the classes in my IDE and look for the right method to override, whatever like that. Finally, we've got class-based views explorer. I'm just going to quickly show you this. If you've never seen it, you might love it. ccbv dot. So you can select your Django version, let's say Django 1.8, and then you can say click on a create view. It shows you all the ancestors. It shows you all the attributes. It's just a great resource for finding out how it's constructed in a sort of alternative way to navigating the source code. So that's a great resource. So I'm going to show you a few notable methods that you might be overriding. Again, this is going to be a very quick tour, so you can have a look at the slides later if you want to see more information, but it's all documented, so I don't need to go into the details too much. Get context data, I'm always overriding. That simply controls what makes its way into the template. So you can have this... actually, out of interest, put your hands up if this is just absolute obvious Python code and in terms of object-oriented stuff. Yeah, okay, so for some of you that probably a complete mess then. All this is I'm just extending and overriding a method. So that first line, context equals and then super, that bit is just getting what the default implementation of get context data would have returned, and then I'm just adding an extra thing to the dictionary and returning it. So that pattern is something that if you're going to override methods, you will be writing all the time. And it's a little bit more simple in Python 3. Get query set. This returns a query set that's used to populate the view. So in list view, if you've got that cat list, then you might say want to limit it in some way. You might want to limit it just to the cats that belong to the current user, say. Or if you've got a detail view, you can use this to restrict access to the cats. So again, you could limit it just to the cats that were authored by the current user, and then if someone else tries to visit that cat, then it will 404. Get object. This is another one which is related to what object gets passed to the template for things like detail views, update views, and delete views. In other words, anything where you just have a single object passed to the template. Form valid. This is run if the form passes validation. I'm not going to go on too much about that because half of the room knows it very well, probably. Get success URL. This returns the URL that your view redirects to if the form passed validation. Very useful. This one, a bit more to it. Get form keyword arguments. I love this because you can start to build APIs within your form so it can expect certain keyword arguments. So, for example, let's say you wanted to have a situation where someone creates a cat and you store the author on that cat. Now, when I first started out with Django, what I'd do is I'd kind of do this all in the view. I'd maybe have the form in the view, and then I'd create it, but the form didn't know who the form didn't have access to the request object. So I don't know if that rings any bells with people, but when you're starting to do things with models and the current user, it's often easy to fall back to the view. But in this case, what we've got here is a form that gets the current user as a keyword argument when you instantiate it, and then it can handle that whole thing for you, so you're not having to do that in the view. So if we look on the right, this is again that same pattern of overriding the method, and all it's doing is it's passing self.request.user to the form and then delegating everything else to the form. This is a really good pattern I found to use, but I won't go through it all now. Now, a couple more sort of higher level things in class-based views is get and post. These are both called when either a get or a post request is made, and they kind of basically handle the whole view. I'm not going to go over that at the moment. And then finally, dispatch is sort of the top level. So if you want to interact with the class-based view sort of before anything else really gets involved, you can do it here. It's particularly good to put things like access restrictions in there, or if you want to kind of set something before any of your other methods might want to know about it. So this is an example where I don't want anyone to get to this view unless the user has already created 10 cats. And if they haven't, then we just redirect to a cat creation page to help them on their way. So, is it necessary to override a method? Well, the answer is often no. Often these method overrides actually have nice, sensible defaults to pull it out of attributes on the view class. So, for example, get success URL, you don't actually need to override that. Normally, you can just set it as an attribute there. And you can just have a look in these methods to see what they're actually looking for. But they're really well designed, I think. So, there are those methods. You will probably encounter them a lot if you use class-based views. So part 3, mix-ins and custom views. So this is sort of more of a matter of opinion, but this is how I like to write my views. So it's easy to get to a situation where you have a really big view and a small form. Some of you might know the idea of fat models in Django, and that kind of means thin views. But I'm going to ignore models for the moment and just talk about views and forms here. I think data processing, if it doesn't actually belong in the model, really should be left to the form and not to the view. So I think a better way is to do something like this, which looks like a complete mess, but actually is not as complicated as it maybe appears. Basically, all I'm saying here is, first of all, it works quite well to write pluggable bits of functionality that you can reuse across your views. So you see that my view is fairly small. It's inheriting from a base view, which might have some standard application-specific stuff. I mean, create view is an example, but you might write your own special create view that has stuff which is relevant particularly to your website, say. And also you might write a whole load of mix-ins that you'll use to populate certain attributes on the view, do certain checks, things like this. And the same pattern with forms. The reason that my form is bigger than my view is just because often I think it's nice to keep views as small as you can and just involve with linking everything else up. They're kind of controllers after all. So, with that in mind, I'm just going to give 3 little examples, 2 of which are in Django Core and you can use. The third is an example of a custom mix-in. So, login required mix-in. Who uses this? Has anyone ever used this mix-in? Yeah, a few people. It's really useful. Like you just add it and extend, and if you're not logged in, it will redirect you to the login page, and then it will redirect you back to the view afterwards. It's only just in Django Core actually, so in Django 1.9, but it is also in Django Braces, which is a third-party module in exactly the same form. So it's very easy to start using this if you're not using it yet. Success message mixin. This is a very tiny mixin, but I just like it. It just outputs a success message via the messages framework if your form is valid. So that's an example of a couple of small ones where you're just bunging them in a little bit of pluggable functionality. This is the final thing you'll need to concentrate on, possibly at all for today. Final bit of code. So it's a member-only mixin. I'm just going to talk through it briefly. So imagine in this cat website we have a concept of premium membership, which only certain people can access to create their cats. And let's say that's a model called a member profile. So what I've done here is rather than repeatedly check to see if someone's a member throughout the website, instead I've just created a views mixin called member-only mixin. And crucially, at the beginning, I've written some documentation, because if you don't document your mixins, you'll probably get very confused very quickly. So spend some time documenting these mixins and how they're meant to behave. And then you see we've extended dispatch. We're checking to see if the user is anonymous. If it's not, then redirect them to login. If it is, try and get their member profile. If it doesn't exist, then deny them permission. You could also redirect to a sign-up page or something for paying for a membership, say. And then if all of that passes, then you can just carry on with whatever the view is doing. And notice that I'm setting the member profile on the view itself with that self.memberProfile line. It's really nice to do that because then you know that you can just put that in there. You know it's there because you know they're a member, and then in any of your views that use this mixin, you can just do what you want with it. It's really easy to access. Once you've written that, it's as simple as just putting it in your cat create view, along with maybe some other mixins like the success mixin, and you've got all that functionality. So I mean, the main principle of this is writing views to try and configure them so that you're not writing loads and loads of boilerplate code. And I feel like something like this is much more kind of declarative syntax. If you're just saying, this is what the cat create view is meant to do, and you're not getting too involved in how to do that. That's split off into other mixins. So, in conclusion, use class-based views, a third of you. I think you should. The other 2/3, keep using them. Use generic class-based views, which you're probably doing. I don't know if many people don't use those if they're using class-based views. And finally, though it's a bit of a matter of opinion, keep views as small as possible, abstracting out generic behavior into custom views and mixins. It's just about this, thinking about it in terms of never repeating yourself, splitting up things into little pluggable bits of behavior. And that's really fundamentally why I love class-based views, is that you can start to write these pluggable things which outsource your, having to think about that stuff, and you just put it in one place. So, that's the end of the talk. Anyone got any questions? Yeah. So there's something called a method resolution order, and it's a bit complicated. But yeah, essentially, usually you'll have the base class to the right, and then put a load of mixins in. And yeah, I think generally, but it's not quite as simple as that. Correct me if I'm wrong. If anyone knows more about this, it's like I think because some of the mixins could extend from other. So there might be shared classes that they both extend from. There's like a whole algorithm which is called the method resolution order. Yeah. The parent class and go to the grandparent and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?